Good morning, everybody. Happy Sabbath. It's lovely to see everybody today. Let's open with a word of prayer, silent prayer, please. Amen. Okay, so nice to be with you and nice to be able to present again to you. And I'm not going to do the 25-20 today. I'm going to do a different subject for a bit of a change. And before we get going, I just wanted to explain that I'm not going to do it interactive today. Last time I presented was really wonderful, and I did an interactive review of Elder Tessa's study, and it was great. I really enjoyed the interaction, and I find it really fun and interesting to do it that way, and I wish we could do it that way today, but I don't think that there's going to be enough time for me to fit all the material in if we have open discussion throughout. So if you could stay muted, I'd appreciate that, and reserve any questions you have for the end, please. Throughout, I might pose questions during my presentation, but I'm not expecting you to answer them. I will answer them. So just hope that that's okay. Now, I hope everybody's up to date with the camp meeting that's just been, the IPR camp meeting, and also the studies that were done last Sabbath on September 11. Because this review that I'm going to do today is based on some of that material. So I would encourage you to catch up if you haven't, for two reasons. One is it's good to be up to date anyway. Also, we're going to the Levites soon, so we need to sort of keep up and make sure that we're getting prepared for that, because we'll be required to defend our beliefs or try to change other people's minds. So if you can prepare for that now, that would be good. There's also another camp meeting coming up in a few weeks' time, and I guess the subjects will move forward, and you don't want to get left behind. You sort of want to have things under your belt and then progress forward if you can. So let me encourage you to catch up on those if you haven't already. But hopefully today, the review I'm going to do hopefully should make sense to you if you haven't already seen the original one anyway. Yes, I'm hoping that's the case. So the subject that I'm going to talk about today is a review of the concept of forced celibacy and the issues regarding marriage for LGBTQ people, and looking at it from the point of view of what God says about celibacy. So we'll be looking at today. I hope to take you through the logic as far as I've understood it, step by step, and walk us through. So it'll be good, perhaps just revision for some of us, and maybe it'll just give a slightly different slant or some visualization that may help as well in case things were a little bit murky there. So hopefully I help and not hurt. So yeah, let me see where we're going to go there. So the first point I wanted to make about this issue is that we need to remember that marriage is an institution that was given in Eden. So we had Sabbath and marriage instituted in Eden by God. When we're talking about different topics, they may not be quite as serious as this one. This is a very serious issue because it is instituted by God in Eden. The implications of that is that an institution is got the word statute built into it. Statute is law. We also have the idea that marriage was ordained by God. It's an ordinance. And the word ordain also has got to do with giving of law. So the fact that it's a law given by God makes it extremely serious and not a matter to be trifled with. And you have people on both sides of the issue of gay marriage that both feel strongly that it's really important, and the reason being because it's got to do with what God's will is. And so that makes it something that they're not willing to compromise on necessarily. Christians may be willing to extend rights to homosexuals up to a certain point, or when they're getting into this territory where it's a law by God, that's when we get into more stronger feelings and Yeah, justifiably so. So the question then becomes, because we also agree it's got to do with a law given by God, question then becomes, what is his will? And how do we know what his will is? And the way we determine what God's will is will vary from each side. One will be using a certain methodology and the other side will be using a different methodology. That is, we are using a different methodology to another group that would take a thus saith the Lord in a plain way, and we would apply methodology to that thus saith the Lord, or the series of thus saith the Lords that are available on this subject. So just keeping that in mind, and also wanting to bring in a Bible verse here as well to remind us. Many of you may have this memorised, Romans 12 verse 2, and I'll read the second half first. That you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So the first half will tell you how you can prove what that good and acceptable and perfect will of God is, and that's what we want to know, the will of God. First half of the verse, and be not conforming to this world or generation or time, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. So the renewing of your mind there, I've underlined on my notes. We have to be open to having our minds renewed, to being open-minded. And let me encourage you as we go through to have an open mind, to allow the methodology to do its work, not to hold tightly onto those ideas that are popular in your environment, that you've held perhaps in the past, but that you would look at this objectively and rationally and see if the process speaks for itself. And perhaps you're already convinced, or perhaps you're not. There may be a mixture of people here. So hopefully this process will help you to go through the logic of our methodology and how it brings us to where it does. So who enjoys maths? Do you enjoy mathematics? Did you enjoy high school mathematics? Let's do a little bit of math to start with, a bit of fun. We're going to start with basic set theory. Okay, we're going to compare a lemon and a banana. All right, let's talk about lemons first. They're sour, yellow, they're juicy, and they're fruit. Bananas, they're sweet, they're yellow, it's a fruit, and grows in tropical climates. Okay, so obviously in here we would find what's the same. So we've got yellow and it's fruit. But this one is sour, this one is juicy, and this one is sweet and tropical. Okay, so easy, nothing too hard here. What methodology does this remind you of?
Compare and contrast.
Yeah. Looking at these areas, contrast. Okay, so when I draw Venn diagrams through this presentation, I'm just illustrating compare and contrast. We're just looking at it visually, and hopefully using this will just help us to picture the process as we go through step by step. Compare and contrast. All right, so that's the basics of basic set theory. It's not a comprehensive lesson on set theory. So let's go on to our first subject. We're now going to apply this. So many of us in this movement would be familiar with the nature of man studies, and if you've done baptismal classes, you would have covered this in Vow 12. So I'll just jot that there. Okay, so if you want resources, supporting texts, things like that, I won't go into it in a lot of depth now, but if you want to find proof texts and things like that for this topic, you could look up Vow 12 and look at the readings that go with that as a starting point. But for now, I'll just assume that most of us are aware of these things, okay? So we have the nature of Christ. He was born in sinful nature or sinful flesh. Okay, and so were we. Now, did we have a choice in what nature we were going to be born into? No, we had no choice. Okay, and did God have a choice? Did God have a choice whether or not he was going to send Jesus in sinful flesh or perfect flesh? No, he had no choice. He had no choice because he has to have the same rules for himself as he has for us. So the same rules that govern God's behaviour govern our behaviour. What he requires of us, he requires of himself. What he does himself, he requires of us. So things he can do, we can do. Things that we can't do, he can't do. He doesn't bend the rules. So he didn't send Jesus to earth in a perfect flesh with no weaknesses or vulnerabilities. He actually came with weaknesses, and he was given a body with weaknesses and vulnerabilities, just like we had. And he had to do that. That had to be the case. He couldn't have sent Jesus in a perfect human form, like pre-fall. So he had no choice based on that. We know that God's law is his character, and we know that he has to behave in keeping with his own character. So his character, or the laws and the principles of his kingdom, governs his own behaviour, just like it governs our behaviour. So we're not held to different standards. It kind of reminds me of the American Constitution that we were just talking about, how the Constitution is supreme above even the executive powers, as well as the states and everything else. The leader of the nation has to act and behave in line with the principles of the nation. Otherwise, they can be impeached and they're not worthy to hold office. So we see sort of some similarities there between the American Constitution, I think. So, yeah, that's just a bit about no choice there. So no choice for both, sinful nature for both. And we know that Jesus was without sin. So sin can't be sinful nature. It's something different. It can't be sinful nature and be without sin unless they're separate things. So I'll put sin over here. Sin down here. Okay, there's no connection there because Jesus had no sin, but yet he had a sinful nature or sinful flesh. So sinful nature cannot equal sin. Okay, so what does that mean for us? Sin is out here. It is not equivalent with sinful nature. It doesn't even overlap. That doesn't mean we don't do it. You might draw a bigger square around that and say that's a human being, but sin is not sinful nature. Why? Another reason sin is separate is also because it is a choice. This what is a choice here. If something is a choice, then you can be blamed for it. You can be held responsible for the sins that you do. If something is not a choice for you, if it was impossible for you to avoid doing something, then how could you be held responsible for that or be declared guilty? If we were to say that sin was not a choice, you could then say, why blame me? I couldn't help it. So we know that sin is not, it is a choice. And we know that Jesus chose every time, 100% of the time, not to sin. So we're just going to differentiate between the two. One is a choice and one isn't. And so therefore, sinful nature is not sin. If we bring them together, I actually think that they're identical. I don't actually find any differences between his nature and our nature. I was thinking you could say the time in which he lived, but then he lived amongst other human beings in his own time anyway. So there's really no difference between Christ's nature and our nature, and that is the whole point of the gospel. That is where the power of it lies, because it's identical. It's the fact that they're identical that's what gives us hope. Hope that we could potentially live without sin. Hope that there's any chance for us to avoid sin. Otherwise, it seems hopeless for us to be able to overcome sin, especially if Jesus came in a different kind of body to us. We say, sure, he could overcome sin, but he had easier time than us. How we can't achieve that because we have the harder body to deal with. So this is the hope of the gospel. The very fact that they're identical natures. I won't fill it in there, but you would just put them all in there, okay? So that's just point one. We'll just pop that idea up on the board and just put it to the side for a moment and move on. Okay, I'll just clean them. And we'll come back around to that point in a little bit. So now we're going to compare and contrast sexual orientations. Okay, so let's start with the easiest part. What is different between the two? What is the contrast? Okay, same-sex attraction, or perhaps both for a bisexual here. And here we have opposite sex attraction. Now, neither side can actually explain how or why they have that reflex in their system, why they would react to a certain body or gender as opposed to the other one. You see heterosexual people probably haven't really ever questioned it, but if you consider, could you force yourself to stop being attracted to someone of the opposite sex and make yourself attracted to somebody of the same sex as yourself? How much therapy or forcing yourself to do that, would it actually change that reflex that happens in you? No, it wouldn't. Homosexuality, the same thing. And in their case, it's really been tried and tested for so many years and created a lot of harm and distress. If you were to research the subjects of conversion therapy or medical procedures that have been done, the evidence shows that it hasn't been successful. And also research into how and why these mechanisms happen, why, what's going on in the brain have not been definitively understood, at least till now. So we don't have an answer for how and why on the side of homosexuality, but we also don't have an answer for how or why on the side of heterosexuality. So this actually goes in the middle here, along with it not being a choice. So I'll pop those two up. If your heterosexuality is not a choice, you can't help your feelings that you have and the responses that you have for the opposite sex. They're totally legitimate. You didn't imagine them. You're not lying to yourself. You're not trying to fit in with the popular crowd. They're real and legitimate feelings that you have and should be respected and believed by people. So I put the word legitimate up there. The same reasoning would go for the other side here too. If it's a reflex and there's no choice, it's real, and so it's legitimate and needs to be believed and not written off. Legitimate. So hopefully we can all agree on those points so far. The point here I want to make is that we need to be consistent. When we're arguing a point for one side, we need to be consistent in our reasoning for the other side. We can't apply different rules or conditions to one side than the other to be consistent to both groups. Consistency is important in our methodology. Apply the same rules to both. So let's make this one group now. Okay, call that one sexual orientation in general, bringing these two together. And we're going to compare it to this one here, sinful nature. No choice, no choice. This one cannot be sin if it's not a choice. So this one cannot be, is not sin either because it's not a choice. Put that here, no choice, not sin. Okay. Now, there's also contrast. And the fact that we're comparing sexual orientation with sinful nature, does that mean that it's the same as sinful nature? Does it mean that it's bad? No, it doesn't. We know that parables are the forcing together of objects or concepts that are very different, and you force them together and then you compare and contrast them. It doesn't mean that they're the same thing. They can be very different things. I am not the same as my dog. Very different, but there's some things that are similar between us. And you can see that all through our prophetic studies when we bring things together. For example, we have the King of the North and the King of the South. There's some similarities that are very different. So I just wanted to point out there that one shouldn't be offended by this comparison or comparing and contrasting between these two. It doesn't mean or imply that same-sex attraction is like sinful nature. It is just comparing one aspect of that. Okay, so I'm going to just pop that up there. I'm going to keep that concept as well and move on. I'm going to write it up as same-sex attraction because that's what we're really dealing with. But it would have, all sexual orientation really. Same. No choice. So hopefully you're satisfied that I've proven that point. All right, now we're going to look at some texts, two inspired texts. We're going to look at Adventist Home, and we're going to look at Matthew 19. And we're going to look at celibacy. So we're going to compare, I'm going to put two circles up, marriage and celibacy. I'm going to put up here, we're looking at the primary application first. Which is a good place to start. And the primary applications are dealing with men. Because they're both about what Jesus was saying, and in his day and age, it was men that were doing all the initiation of marriages, and the women were really they're not part of the equation, they're not able to have a say. So this is to do with men. So just keeping that in mind, because we're going to take the primary application, then we're going to step through to women after that. So we're just going to go in order to make sure that we've dotted all our I's and crossed all our T's. So it's about men, the quotes are about men, it was sexist cultures. That sexism even continues today, but it has affected Ellen White's writings as well. And we're going to just read that paragraph. Adventist Home 121.2. So this is it. Jesus did not enforce celibacy upon any class of men. He came not to destroy the sacred relationship of marriage, but to exalt it and restore it to its original sanctity. He looks with pleasure upon the family relationship where sacred and unselfish love bears sway. So we'll just pop that in dot points here. He did not enforce celibacy. Point 2, upon any class of men. Let's look at that first. So celibacy was not forced on any class of men. So marriage and celibacy are really like two sides of the same coin, right? But I've kept them separate because there is a little difference that we'll get around to at the end of this section. But for now, I'm going to put free choice here because he didn't enforce celibacy. This text is saying that it was a free choice, whether or not he wanted to be celibate. So then, if you can choose whether or not you want to be celibate, you can choose whether or not you want to be married. So I'll put free choice over here. This point here, upon any class of men. So celibacy was optional for every class. So I'll just put any class here. No, I'll put every. Every class. Let's think of some classes that we might be thinking of here. Might think of let's do class. Race, okay, so if you're Ethiopian or you're any nation around, any race, then Jesus would not have forced you to be celibate. Race, age, ability. These are different classes of people, different religions. You might say wealth is not a requirement, and so on and so forth. That's what we're kind of thinking of when we're talking about classes. So here, marriage is available for every class. Okay. Because it's the same for both. It's not in this text, but we can also see this one here is lifelong. And when we're talking about celibacy in this context, he didn't force celibacy. He's talking about lifelong celibacy. Lifelong. Okay. So these are all the same so far. Wasn't forced, has to be a free choice for marriage. Any class could choose. And we've considered the different classes. I would like to phrase this as that this proves that God has given every class of men the fundamental God-given right to marry. It's God-given and it's for every class of men. So it's a right for them to marry. So it's like a human right. So now we're going to look at the next bit, which is not to destroy. He didn't come to destroy. No, not destroy, but the opposite. It says here. The opposite here is it exalts. Exalts. And restore it to its original sanctity. Okay. And then the last bit here, I'll put a smiley face. He looks with pleasure. It's what he cares about when he's thinking about marriage. Sacred and unselfish love in families. Okay. And I think it's important not to just discount that last bit because it shows what he's interested in when he looks at marriage, sacred and unselfish love. All right, so why though, right? Why would it destroy marriage if one class was forced into celibacy? Why would it ruin it for everybody? How would it affect everybody if one class was prevented from being able to marry? That's a question I want to come back to a little bit further in our study, but we'll just establish that there. One other comment I wanted to make about this passage is its context. So Adventist Home is compilation, and the original context comes from MS 1269 of 1903. Put it. 26, 1903. The title of that piece of work, it's called Christ at the Marriage Feast, and it's about Jesus at the marriage of at Cana. That's the context, and it talks about how he came there to honour the marriage that was going on there. And so this is where this quote actually comes from. Marriage at Cana is a marker for this way month that we're at right now. So I feel like it's quite apt that this paragraph actually comes from that context. And I think it's confirmation that just like Jesus did, this movement is exalting marriage and restoring it to its original sanctity right now at this way mark. That's what is actually happening here right now. So that's encouraging. So that's no forced celibacy. I'm going to rub out part of that, and then we're going to look at Matthew 19, verses 11 to 12. Okay, so the context is the Pharisees are trying to tempt Jesus. They question him about divorce, and then the conversation moves on to the subject of celibacy. So you could look at the text to read that. But just picking up from verse 11, but he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. So I'll just do the dot points as we go this time. For there are some eunuchs which are so born from their mother's womb. Eunuchs. So eunuchs 1, they're born that way, so from birth. 2. And there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, so they've been harmed. Okay, and the third group are voluntary eunuchs. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. All right, so eunuchs types 1 and 2, they were involuntary, right? This one's voluntary, these ones don't have a choice. So what needs to be understood here is this actually a decree by Jesus? Is he saying that this is a principle? Or is this I'll just put observation. So is it a principle or an example? So when we're looking at texts, it's really important that people who read Bible verses understand the context and the cultures in which things were going on and what the context of the whole environment was. It wasn't like it is in modern day times. Marriage operated differently in ancient Israel than it does today. So if a man had been harmed by that, there's a couple of reasons why he might not have gotten married. One is he didn't desire to anymore because his testosterone level is not very high. So, his desire to get married was taken away. But there may be others that wanted to marry but couldn't. And was it because they thought God wouldn't let them, or was it because they couldn't find somebody? You would have to find another man who would let his daughter marry you, and it probably wouldn't be a secret that you're a eunuch, right? So you would struggle to find a wife. So you need to consider context and culture when considering this passage. The implications are, if this was a decree or a principle, that would have implications for us today, because principle is like it's a principle. I guess it's like a law that just doesn't change, so it would still apply to people today. So that would mean that, if you're infertile or harmed in any way physically, that God wouldn't let you marry somebody. And that's not what we believe, is it? We don't believe that you have to be fertile to marry. And we wouldn't stop people that have had any harm done to them from marrying somebody that they love. So there are implications for not just for LGBT people, but for people more broadly, if it is actually considered it to be a decree. But we know that it's not, because the Bible is full of examples, and we just need to be careful to differentiate between principles and examples. So I'll just write that there too. Implications. A decree. decree. So what Jesus is doing here, he's talking to a group of people. He's saying, you know, this is what I'm observing. Some people are involuntary, some are. And then he's talking about he that can receive it, let him, or not everyone can receive this. So I'm just going to say that this is not like a God's will thing, that these people are celibate. It's not like God is making them do that. We have also Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 7 to 9. I will read this one as well, but I won't write it up. And here we see Paul also talking about it being something that is voluntary. He says, "For I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it's good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn." See here that Paul is saying it's a good way to live, but it's not an involuntary thing that's going to be forced upon you. You can change your mind. What is Paul doing here? He's giving them an opt-out available option, so you can opt out at any time. So I'll put here an easy opt-out, okay, from Paul. An easy opt-out. Just stop being celibate if you find it too hard. But here in marriage, we don't see an easy opt-out. We see a restricted opt-out. So there is a bit of a contrast there. Just put that there so you can see that they're different. Right, so we're going to move on now, so we can see that the celibacy was optional for, at least for men. And now we're going to consider women. So what about women? How do we apply that? So like I said, women couldn't initiate back then, so they weren't part of the equation. It wasn't even something that anybody would have asked about, I suppose. But these days, women can initiate relationships, as we know from our Midnight Cry message and so forth. And our culture generally allows it as well. We don't have scripture quotes to prove that we can put women in here without having to go into whole separate studies or anything. I will just direct us to our Midnight Cry message and the proper methodology that's been applied that proves that women have equality with men. So we can remove the word men based on that. Other studies and other methodologies that prove equality. Also will comment too that with these ones here, women who were barren, they didn't generally experience this sort of thing. They end up getting married because nobody could tell they were barren until after they were married. So they didn't experience quite the same situation as the men did, perhaps, that were known to be, you know, damaged or harmed or defective, whatever, from birth or whatever. So these two really kind of do apply to men only. But we did see that in any case, this is not a decree from God, and involuntary celibacy isn't a decree by God. So we can remove the word men there and just make it people. That's a celibacy and men for people in general. So hopefully you can just follow the logic through on all this. So I'm going to put up here our summary that there's no forced celibacy for any class of people. And so marriage is a God-given human right for every class. So I just want to think now about Adventist home passage and how we were talking about why it would affect everybody if you denied marriage to a certain class. Now, these are my thoughts, so this is a bit of a disclaimer, but I'm just thinking about how would it affect your marriage or my marriage or anybody's marriage if a certain group doesn't have the right to marry, they don't receive the right in the first place. That means it's not a human right anymore. It becomes a privilege. And then we would have to discuss who is privileged, who gets the privilege of getting married and who doesn't get the privilege. And then every class comes up for debate, and it could be your class. There would be a ripple effect. Okay, so I'm just going to call that a ripple effect, which was mentioned in the studies done. What would end up happening is the institution of marriage begins to unravel because you start to question one group and then that would then spread to another and another and another. We can see sometimes people have argued that homosexuals can't make babies, so therefore they wouldn't have the right to get married because they can't generate children. There would be a ripple effect from that if you go down that argument, because there are people that are postmenopausal that you would then have to say they can't get married. You have young people that have been told by their doctor they're never going to have children. They would then not be blessed by God in their marriages. If they did get married, that would be against God's will and something bad. It would just have this ripple effect that goes on to everybody. That's something that would happen if you start denying marriage to any kind of class based on their class and denying it to a group of people. Then you're saying it's not a universal human right. It's just for some and makes it a privilege. We have seen this ripple effect happen in reverse. For example, the 14th Amendment. It was written at the end of the Civil War, and it had to do with ex-slaves. That's what they had in mind, right? They weren't thinking about women and, homosexuals and things like that at the time. They wanted to know, they've just freed the slaves. Now, what is their freedom actually going to look like now? What is freedom and what does that mean? Sort of laying out their rights, I guess. But they had blacks in mind. They didn't have, perhaps, immigrants in mind or other things like that. But today, the 14th Amendment is used to defend the rights of women, disabled people, different religions, ethnicities, atheists, LGBTQ, all use the 14th Amendment to defend their rights. That's because of the ripple effect. It granted human rights to one group, and then there would be no reason why that same logic wouldn't apply to another group. You would use the same reasoning to justify equality for another group. So we would then see the freedom and the rights expanding. So it's sort of in the good direction, we see that ripple effect happening. Also in this movement, we can see that happened with our Midnight Cry message. We started looking at what was the issue with race in another dispensation. Then we looked at women, we've studied women, and the same logic was applied from race to women. And then the same process is now being applied to LGBTQ. It's the same logic and the same reasoning and the same arguments. We could call it the same rules. And we're not applying one set of rules to one group and a different set of rules to another group. We're applying one set of rules to every group, which is consistency. If we deny one group, then we would deny them all, because that undermines the whole argument. The same arguments you would use to undermine rights for LGBTQ people, the same arguments then you would apply to other groups. And so that is why when it is said, if you reject this formalisation, you never accepted the Midnight Cry, because if you had accepted it, then you would see that to be consistent, you need to now apply it to another group. You have to accept with this Midnight Cry all or nothing, and there's no way of picking one or two of your favourite groups. You can't just pick and choose and cherry pick. So to summarise that, I'm just going to note that if I'm going to write there that it's marriage is damage for all when it's denied to some, based on that logic of the ripple effect. Okay, so we're just going to look at LGBTQ a little bit as well now, a little bit more specifically. So I'll write up there a question. These classes of people, does it include LGBTQ people? Sorry. So marriage is sacred. We've already discussed that, and that's step one. So we understand that marriage is sacred, and we've talked about the ordinance of marriage. It was ordained. It's a law. It was given to humankind, like Sabbath was given for the benefit of humankind, and to glorify God. So we know that God's will has to do with this. So yeah, God's will must be considered or understood. And we talked about Romans 12 verse 2 and how to understand that we need to be prepared to have the renewing of our mind. We see a group of, we're just going to focus on Christianity, but homophobia is across many cultures, times, but for the purpose of this study, I'm just going to focus on Christians that argue against. We can see that what kind of methodology do they use when they argue against gay marriage? They're using bad methodology. They tend to use the thus saith the Lord's only. They just take the verses, takes them 10 seconds to formulate their opinion, and then they argue it with force and vigour. And yeah, it's not pretty usually. Bad methodology, thus saith the Lord on its own. Got two options. Yeah. Or some people just have no methodology and they just say, they don't even consider scripture as methodology. What do they say? They have two concepts that they're pretty strong on. Marriage. They say it's clear, obvious. When somebody says it's obvious, be careful. If you say to yourself it's obvious, be careful. Marriage is only, let's just say, male plus female. Right? That's God's will. It's clear in the Bible. One man, one woman married, and that's the rules. Okay. 2, therefore, LGBTQ, they have to stay single for life. They have to stay single for life if they want to get to heaven. If you're a Christian LGBTQ person, you can keep going to church and that as long as you say, I'm not having any activity of any kind, I'm very strict with myself, and I'm going to live celibate for the rest of my life. Very hard. But that's the conditions of entry to heaven. So these are the two doctrines that they hold to their bad methodology. Now we'll look at what our good methodology has brought us to. This is like a compare and contrast as well. All right, so I'm going to list some things about our methodology. What features do we use in our methodology? The first thing that probably comes to mind is we use parables. Parable methodology. But that's not all we use. We understand passages in context. Okay. We consider the concept of progression. Dispensationalism. We also, and this is very important, we need to understand and follow the true stream with science and with history, especially when considering this issue. Both have a false stream that this side can use to defend themselves. But we also know that there is real science and more accurate history, and you have to just be really careful. So all of these things go into making up our good methodology. There may be some things I've missed there. I also was going to point out that we need to know that the Bible is a book of what? Examples. Okay. Many, many things in the Bible are examples of how principles applied in a certain dispensational time. And it's not necessarily an eternal truth that's for every place and times wherever. So we just need to be careful, and I think in this movement we are, that the Bible passages need to be read in that mindset as well. So what have we done here with these two? We're at the moment, I'll put a question mark here, as in it's being considered. Being considered is marriage, is only male and female. Question marks, okay. And then two, what we've just come to through our study, through the other comparative trusts we did, we came to the opposite here. Forcing anyone to stay single undermines marriage and is sin. It's sin because you're undermining God's law. You know, it's against God's will to undermine the institute that He set up, so it's sin. Forcing anyone to stay single or be celibate. It undermines marriage and it's sin. Hopefully you can read that. Yeah, it should be okay. All right, forcing anyone to, okay, so now if it's true that same-sex attraction isn't a choice, then this becomes a problem. If it was a choice and they could happily change or easily or reasonably easily change, or I would even say it has to be if they could change at all, then you're not forcing them to be single. But because they can't change, it is force to restrict marriage to just male and female. You can't hold these two as it stands there. You can't hold them both at the same time. They're contradictory terms for a class of people. So we would have to say it cannot be. Cannot be because of this. So get rid of the question mark as the answer has come. Marriage cannot only be for male and female, because if it was, God would be forcing a group of people to be celibate for life. So this right that here that's coming to light now, it's not a right that's being given to them. It's a right that's already theirs. It's a human right for everyone. So it's not like somebody's giving them something now. It's something that they already had, and we're just learning about it. And if we can protect their right, what we are doing is actually protecting everybody's right. Your right, my right, everybody's right, and the institution is held intact. To summarise, we looked at sinful nature. It's not sin because it's not a choice. We can see that in the life of Christ. We see the same issue with same-sex attraction. It's not a choice, so it's not sin. That's dealing with the attraction, but not the behaviour. But the attraction itself is not a sin, but there's no choice, it's permanent. Then we learn how there's no forced celibacy for any class. That's God's purpose, that there's no celibacy for any class. And so therefore, marriage is a God-given human right, because God is giving that right, not forcing celibacy on anyone. We then learned that the problem with forcing celibacy is that it damages marriage for everyone if it's denied to some, because it's then questioning whether it's a human right or not. Then you start to undermine that and make it a privilege. And from there we went to these two doctrines which create a problem, especially here once we've decided that you can't make a group stay single. And so the only then other option is to change this one here so that they're not contradictory. And we can hold these two and know that that's proven and supported by the methodology and what we know of God's character and the Bible and the text that we've read. So hopefully that was helpful, and let's close in prayer. Dear Lord God in heaven, we thank you that you have one set of rules that applies to all. We thank you that you don't bend rules for yourself. You don't bend rules for certain privileged groups. And we thank you that we have a message that will bring a lot of freedom to many people. We ask that you would help us to prepare our skills in understanding the arguments that we would use to defend our message, especially as we prepare to interact with other people. We ask that you would help us to have these thoughts clear in our mind so that we're very convicted ourselves, and we can therefore transmit quite confidently and clearly the methodology and the reasoning used to defend the truth. We thank you for the light that you have brought through your servants that we can copy, learn and understand and share. We ask that you would help us to continue to yield to allow you to renew our minds and to change our very being through the renewing of our mind, that we may more perfectly reflect your character and your glory to the world around us, that you may receive all the glory and honour and praise that you deserve. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.